This is Talking Drupal, a bi-weekly chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. Recorded live on Wednesday afternoons in a Google Hangout. Visit us at talkingdrupal.com. This is episode 116, Wednesday, March 23rd, 2016. Deploying Drupal. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Good afternoon.
So Google Hangout changed on us again this week. Usually I hear a ding in my ear when I hit record, and then when it starts recording, and those dings never came. So I'm thinking there's an uncomfortable pause there at the beginning. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I was about to do the intro. I wasn't sure if you
No.
didn't notice.
Yeah, no, there's usually a ring. It rings a bell in your ear, but the bell's gone. It disappeared. So,
Not-
I mean, it's
not
the
for us.
it's the ever-changing what will Google Hangout do this week. So welcome. Hi, John. How you doing? John Picozzi from Oomph is joining us as usual. What's new with you, John?
Good afternoon. Nothing. Busy as usual. Working on some cool projects in Drupal and loving every minute of it.
Excellent. And Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Development.
Yeah, so I'm happy to say I've got a new logo this week. Just got it yesterday. So looking forward to updating collateral. Got it on Twitter already and my website, but I think it looks a lot sharper than what I've had in the past. So looking forward
Nick,
to.
where'd you get the
turning some
logo
good stuff.
from? Where did you get it from? Like 9,000 Designs, or did you have a friend do it?
I had a graphic designer that I worked with on a lot of projects pulled together. So neither. It wasn't a friend. Well, I suppose a friend, but it wasn't a favor, but it also wasn't one of those sites. So professionally designed. I think it came out really nice. New color scheme. So looking forward to updating my website to match all that as well.
That's good. I'm happy to see you. I noticed it as soon as you connected it this morning, I guess.
Yeah, so I finally got rid of the turtle
Yeah.
icon picture.
Is that what that was? I thought it was strawberries.
No, it was Raz Turtle. It was a little turtle that was photoshopped into a raspberry.
Okay.
We're
I
already
never
off
quite,
the rails.
yeah, I never quite understood what your logo was, but now I get the N with a light bulb. Works perfectly. So our topic today is deploying Drupal, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about automated ways to get code from a dev to QA site to a live environment. That's really the topic today, and the three of us couldn't talk about this alone without having an expert with us. So we've brought in Rob Aubin from Oomph. Welcome, Rob.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is your second tour with us on Talking Drupal. You visited us on episode 88, so you can go to talkingdrupal/088. And that day, we used your expertise that day to talk about load testing.
That's
So,
right.
yeah, so for those who did not hear episode 88, Rob is the director of engineering at Oomph. Has been there for 6 years. That's the company that John works with. He works with his engineering team to improve and troubleshoot code. He works with the sales team to spec out new projects and does lots of code reviews.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I cut out there a minute. Sorry. Are you guys there?
Yeah, you did
okay.
drop for a couple seconds.
Yeah,
but
okay. Yeah, I could see it a little wonky on my screen. So he's also an outdoors guy, likes to do hiking, mountain biking, and he also trains in martial arts. I didn't know that, Rob. So
Been doing that for a long time.
yeah, so welcome to Talking Drupal again.
Thanks. I'm just back from vacation from last week. I was in Florida, so I'm just getting back into the swing of work again, and I came back, and of course it snowed.
It did. Oh, but not a lot. Come on now.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, that was a
Any
late snowstorm.
Any snow this late in the season is too much, right?
So Rob, what is a vacation like for you?
Well, we
Describe
have a
vacation. When you say Florida, it kind of reminds me of Disney World and stuff, and those to me aren't typical vacations. But
no. It was to visit friends and family this time around, and we've got an almost 9-month-old baby, so this was our first vacation with the baby, first flight, and so it was a little bit different than vacations in the past, but it was equally as fun. New adventures.
That's good. And what did you do with the second child?
The dog, you mean, Hurley?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, the office dog Hurley stayed with some friends of ours, so he had a nice play date for an entire week with a golden retriever that's probably 3 times his size, and he loved every minute of it.
Oh, good. So he had a vacation as well.
That's right.
Excellent. All right. So before we get into the show topic, a few tips for the week. John, you have one. TunnelBear. What is TunnelBear? What are you talking about there?
So TunnelBear is actually an app, and one of my coworkers turned me on to it. It's an app you can put on your computer, and it basically allows you to set your location from anywhere around the world. They have a bunch of different locations, proxies, I guess you could call them, and you can basically turn on TunnelBear, set the location that you want to basically tunnel in from, and it will pretend like you're in that country. The reason I needed this was I was doing some geolocation testing on a website, and I needed to test to make sure that if I was outside of the United States, the website was doing what it was supposed to do, and so on and so forth. So TunnelBear allows me to do that. It allows me to basically flip a switch and say, oh, I'm in France, or oh, I'm in Canada, or oh, I'm in Singapore. So I'm actually going to be using it this week to do some more geolocation testing on another site, but very useful, very easy. You get 500 megs, I think, free to start at a base account. So if you're just using it for testing, that really works out for you. But every so often they'll run promotions where they'll give you additional throughput if you tweet about them or do something. So has kind of like the incentives that you might see on like Dropbox or something like that.
Very cool.
Yeah, excellent. Never heard of that. That's a good tip. Nick, you have something about Drush.
Yeah, so I had the joy and pleasure of running some migrations again recently, and one thing I found generally it's helpful to. There's a couple ways you can write a migration. You can write it in code, or you can write it in the UI, and both work for different situations. But I find always, no matter how you built the migration, you should use Drush to run the migration. Migrations tend to be fairly expensive, and they almost always time out or cause problems if you run them through the UI. And Drush gives you a lot of tools to manage the migrations. The two main ones are MS, which gives you the Drush MS gives you the migration status, and Drush MI space the name of the migration will actually run the migration. You can also roll them back or stop them. And it tends to be much faster than doing it through UI as well. So if you're doing a migration, use Drush.
So are you talking 6, 7, 8? What are you talking about here?
Ooh, whenever. I personally have done most migrations into 7.
Right.
I've run, I think, one really minor one to Drupal 8, but yep. I would always use Drush.
Okay. So I have a quick tip for anyone do mind mapping? Does anyone here do mind mapping?
Yeah, I've done that before.
Okay, yeah. It's a habit I've gotten into about a year ago. It's like my first level of brainstorming for any project, any problem I need to solve, even specking out code. Sometimes you can do a mind map, and if you're an Apple person, there's a great Apple app called MindNode. You can get it for your iOS device, and you can also use it on your Apple computer, your Mac, and it's a great way to quickly throw together mind maps. I hate to be in front of my computer when I'm doing a mind map. It feels like to me that it's not the right environment, so I like to do it on my iPad or even on paper sometimes when I'm away from my computer. But MindNode is a great app for the iOS and the computer to capture your mind nodes. Your mind nodes, your mind maps. So if you're into that kind of thing, check out that app. I think it's pretty cheap on all those environments, and it's a great way to get some brainstorming done. So moving on to our topic today, let's talk about like setting the stage here first. What are we really discussing when we're talking about deploying Drupal? I think one of the things we're really talking about today is it's not completely a Drupal topic. It's really more of a code topic. We're going to touch on some Drupal-y parts of this, but it's about having a development environment, staging, testing, production. I mean, could be 3 levels for you, could be 4 levels for you, but we're really talking about some automated ways to move code between those environments. That's really the core of our discussion today. A couple of things we're assuming is that we're using Git as a repository to manage this code. And some of the things we're going to talk about too is we're really talking about environments. I guess it could be a single person, but I guess a lot of these things are really dependent on if you're working with multiple people, that you need to think a little bit more about automation, although I guess it could work with one person that is dealing with many projects too. Which, Nick, I think you're in that boat more often than John and I are, that you're kind of a sole guy, but you're managing, 10 things at one time. Is that, you guys think the stage is set right there for this discussion, or have I missed something?
I mean, I think that's a pretty good overview. I mean, it's also really just about making sure that the process part of deploying is repeatable. So it's not just about making it easier, it's about just making it the same every time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to, like you said, a team or one person. It's really just making sure that the process of getting something from development to staging or production, make that process as repeatable as it can be.
Yeah, and I think that process is not just necessarily getting some files from point A to point B, but it could be, a whole bunch of other steps in that deployment process that, it could be a list of 3 things or 10 things or 15 things, and just a way to, like Nick said, automatically manage those steps so that you don't miss an item or you don't have to really think about it, it just happens.
So, Rob, how critical is this in the environment you're working in, is having a system like this in place?
It's a part of our process in every project at this point, so it's definitely critical. It saves us a bunch of time. It makes it really easy when we start new projects to get these systems in place and get automated deployments set up, and when necessary for the projects that it's relevant for, we can run tests. We can do various build steps, whether it be compiling CSS and running tests and that sort of thing. Linting code to make sure that nothing's being pushed out to production that could break something, preventing regressions and that sort of thing. So definitely mission critical for our team.
What are the risks you see in not implementing something like this?
Just to kind of rattle off a few things that can go wrong, the biggest one I just mentioned is a regression. So you either have somebody who's rushing to get some code out to production and they miss a step in that workflow that needs to be followed, or they push code that's buggy. It could be a syntax error that some automated testing would have caught. There can be just that manual step of pushing a file old school style like SFTP or something like that, and overwriting something that you didn't mean to, or deleting something you didn't mean to. There's just a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong that way.
Yeah, I was going to say, what about the opposite? What kind of risks do you have? What kind of risks exist to having automated deployment?
Sure. Yeah. So the biggest one is deploying when you don't mean to. So what we typically do, and we'll probably talk more about this later, is just deciding which environments you want code automatically deployed to from a given branch within your Git repository, versus ones that you want to make sure that you manage manually and only push code changes when everybody's in agreement that it's supposed to happen, whether it be a schedule that you agree upon with your client or that sort of thing.
So before we move on to some of the strategies here, we're not talking today about content deployment, but I'm interested to know what people think about that in general. Just if you need to deploy content versus code in configuration.
I mean, I think in Drupal, that's definitely one of the biggest questions.
Always.
I mean, how do you get, how do you synchronize environments, get new features out there, and then consistently get the content out at the same time? And there's no easy answer, and it really depends on the particular workflow of the client. I'm sure that you guys probably have more experience in working on more automated deployments with content. It's something that I generally just build into the project. So,
Rob, are you doing any content deployment strategies?
No, I don't think so. It's more one of those things of getting the content staged within the CMS, usually in an unpublished state, or if you're replacing or drafting a piece of content to replace something that already exists. It's always a little bit tricky, right? If you need to deploy code to support, say, a new design or something around some existing content or content that may need to be modified slightly to support that design, there's a timing thing, when you're doing that deployment to make sure that everything lines up and that visitors are seeing what they're supposed to be seeing. So, no, we don't have anything that I know of at this point for deploying content with some of these tools.
Right, which is why it's not a topic today of the show, other than to make people aware that we're not going to talk about that, because clearly we don't have a good solution. All right, so Rob, maybe you could take us into a sort of an overview of what you're doing to do these automated deployments. What is your general strategy here?
Sure. So a while back we were using a tool called Beanstalk for our repositories, and it also had a deployment tool built into it, which later sort of spawned off into its own thing called DeployBot. And we're still using that tool on a few different projects, and essentially what it does is just monitor a Git repository and push code when we tell it to, or on an automated basis. But we also, for the majority of our projects right now, we're using Jenkins, which is just an automation server that runs, it's basically a Java platform. You can run it on Tomcat. So you can run that on one of your existing servers, or I'm sure there's some hosted solutions out there. Right now we're using something in-house. And essentially every one of our Git repositories has at least one, sometimes more than one Jenkins job set up. And what that tool will do is, it'll monitor a Git repository using some of GitHub's integration services. So there's one specifically available for Jenkins, so you don't have to write any code on the GitHub side. You just log into GitHub, go to your repository, go to the settings, and turn it on. And you do need to provide a little key that links to your Jenkins server. And once you do that, you need to configure some stuff in Jenkins. And our workflow right now is typically we have, let's say our master branch, as an example, would be used for production, and then we'll have some other branches for different server environments. So it could be for, like you mentioned, a development environment or one or more staging environments. And depending on how we want to have it configured, we can either manually or automatically deploy code changes to those environments. And Jenkins, being that it's an automated or an automation server, it's not just for pushing code. I know that's sort of our focus today, but I had mentioned a few items earlier about code linting and automated testing. You can configure Jenkins to do all of those things. So however many steps your deployment process contains, you can get those queued up within Jenkins, and it's considered a build. And what's great about Jenkins is you can log in to Jenkins wherever you have it hosted, and you can monitor those builds and see the successes and failures. And if you do have a problem with the deployment, you can look at the console output and troubleshoot that. So it'll tell you where it failed.
Jenkins is running on a server that's independent from the environments that you're developing on or QAing with. You're sitting on a separate machine.
Exactly.
Is it an open source tool that anyone can download and use, or is it a licensed tool?
Yeah, it's I believe it's an MIT license. It's open for use. It's free. And you can read more about this on Wikipedia to kind of hear the history about it. But
Yep.
it was kind of spawned from another project that got picked up by Oracle when they bought Sun Microsystems, and there was a bit of an argument over what should happen with that software because I think Oracle wanted to commercialize it, and so officially, according to Oracle, Jenkins is a fork of another piece of software.
So, and I think it's important to note too, as you had mentioned, Jenkins does tie it directly into GitHub. You can also tie it into any other repo system. It works with Bitbucket, it works with local, not local, but with self-hosted repos as well. So it doesn't just have to be GitHub. It can be wherever you're hosting your repositories.
Yeah. Yep.
So I have a server that I installed Jenkins on, and I can configure this and get it running. Do you know of companies that are also providing a service for Jenkins that I can not install it on a machine that I have, but like sign up for a service that's a Jenkins service somewhere and configure it on someone else's server?
Yeah. I don't know of any by name. I know that there's some out there. I did a quick Google search. Maybe you guys know some.
Yep. Okay. So what are the primary tasks? I know you've mentioned that does a few things, but so if you have a development team that's working on some code and they push some code up to a dev branch, what is the steps for this deployment that you're doing right now, and things people should think about doing themselves?
Yeah, so the primary thing that we do is check the code for any syntax errors. Just do a basic check of it. We will look at the dependencies. We do a lot of stuff with Node and either Gulp, Grunt, or Brunch for compiling CSS and running other tasks. So we can run through that whole process and prepare all that code. So we don't have to have compiled CSS or anything in our repositories. That step will happen through Jenkins, and then Jenkins will push that compiled CSS and compressed JavaScript and all other files to the destination server. So we don't have to maintain those within the repository. So that's probably the biggest task.
What happens if it fails, Rob? What happens when it fails, that process?
Yeah, so Jenkins will indicate through the dashboard that the build failed, and that console output that it provides will give you an indication of where it failed. So the most common things that we see are usually permission errors. So either it can't write to a directory it's trying to push to, or there was an issue with some of the various dependencies to compile those files, those source files.
So, like, if someone has created an issue with a SAS file, so there's a SAS file that it's written improperly and it won't compile. Who gets that error message, and where does that go in your process?
Yeah, so right now what we do is we just sort of monitor the Jenkins dashboard, but I'm sure there's ways to automate either sending those through email to people. We don't have sort of an assigned point person for deployments on most of our projects, so it's whoever needs to push code at a particular time.
I can speak to that actually. So there is a module that Jenkins has that will send out email notifications on builds, and you can configure it to send on build, on failure, on whatever you want. You can also set it up to send to the project owner or a point person, like you said. So it's highly configurable. It wasn't setting up the notifications is fairly straightforward. The particular time I did it was using Amazon's simple email service, so it was a little bit more complex, but the actual email configuration is pretty straightforward. Something else that I think is pretty useful for people out there is you can connect Jenkins to Slack, so that you can just have a channel that reads out all of the deployment notifications. So you can very quickly push something and then get that notification in Slack if something went wrong. You don't have to necessarily log in somewhere else. So all those tools are available.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds pretty neat. I like the idea of a Slack integration. We use Slack for a bunch of other stuff internally. That'd be pretty cool to be able to have that.
And Rob, if you wouldn't mind not trying to do that while we're on the phone, you could configure that when we get off later.
However, it is pretty easy through Jenkins's dashboard to kind of keep track of your build and what's going on. You can kick off your build, and then there's actually a console pane that'll allow you to see exactly what the steps that it's going through, which is actually really good. If there is a problem, you can kind of use that to diagnose what the problem may be, whether it's a SaaS build or permissions or something like that. So
I was thinking about this a little bit, John, in terms of the developer. So I'm sitting working on a project for Rob, and I've committed some code to a development environment, to a development branch. It's my understanding now that there's a Jenkins process that will automatically kick off, Rob, right, and push that code up to and compile it and do whatever tasks you have, move that to a development server.
Yeah.
But me as the developer, I don't know that something I've just committed has failed the Jenkins process. That's where I was sort of thinking about that communication there.
Sure.
Whereas
that makes sense.
With Slack integration, you could have
the
bot just send him a message on Slack saying, "Hey, you just committed uncompilable SAS. Fix it," or whatever the error was, so that it can be fixed. So it's like I said, it's fairly straightforward to set up. I think Slack takes a bit of doing. The email stuff is pretty straightforward, though.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I just described that process as that, hey, I know this is the way you guys work at OOMF, is that if a developer pushes something to the dev branch, it automatically shows up on the dev server. Do you have any caveats to that? Is there some stuff that a developer would push that wouldn't show up in the dev branch or the dev environment? Do you customize that in any way, or just do anything?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely some exclusions from what is deployed. So just to kind of take a step back to the way that the files in our repos are pushed up to a remote server through Jenkins is through a shell script that we wrote. So Jenkins won't just deploy the files unless you give them instructions on how to do that. So we have sort of what we call like a deploy shell script that we include in our projects, and it provides instructions and options for what environments we want to deploy to. And that's picked up by Jenkins, and Jenkins can push that code so long as it's authorized to write or connect to that server. So part of that deployment through that script, it lists whatever files we would not want to include. So for a Drupal installation, that could be, if the files are included within the repository, things that we want to skip. Obviously, anything that's in the git ignore wouldn't be included in the repo. If there's a files directory for Drupal, we wouldn't want to be pushing that because there's going to be live content on that host server or that destination server that we don't want to overwrite. Sometimes there's some customizations to an htaccess file that may be in one environment and not in another, or in one branch and not another. So those may be skipped. A lot of times there'll be a special settings.php file that we use for development teams. Sometimes it's not included in the repository, but sometimes it is, and we may not want to push that to a remote. And then in some cases, we want to include certain files for one destination server, like a development or a staging server, but we don't want to write those to a production server as part of that deployment. So we have that option and that flexibility as well.
So you customize that deployment script based on the project?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess one of the questions for me is who's in charge of managing that kind of the deployment workflow. Like if something goes wrong with the deployment, or there's a new deployment that needs to be put together, is it the responsibility of the developer on the project, or is there a specific deployment engineer, or is there a couple of different people that handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how many people you have dedicated to this in your organization. At our company, we don't have a dedicated say DevOps person to do this, but we do have a few individuals that have a lot of experience with server administration that usually take care of that task. So it's not necessarily on the shoulders of one person, but a few key members of the team.
Okay. So the workflow. So we've just kind of discussed a little bit a workflow from a dev branch to a dev environment. Do you see that workflow the same as going to a dev branch to a QA or testing environment? Is that workflow very similar to what you've described already?
Yeah, it is, with the one difference, or at least one difference that we would have is rather than have an automatic deployment from, say, a development branch to a development server, we would want to have something that's a little more static. So we would change that. There's a configuration file that we use for all of our Jenkins deploys that is a Jenkins-specific file, unlike that shell script I mentioned, and it tells Jenkins whether or not it should automatically or manually do a build. So, and part of the build is that deployment. So for a QA environment or a stage environment, we would want to make sure that even if code is pushed in Git to that branch that we're taking a look at, that it doesn't get deployed until we say so.
And that's really more to a dual purpose for getting the files obviously to that testing or staging server, but also to be able to test that deployment before you're doing it on a production server. To see how things are going to flow, bring in the kind of the content piece of it. I know we're not talking about content, but you have to think about that. Like, how am I going to deploy these files if I need to make content changes that are affecting them or vice versa? So pushing out to that testing server can emulate that process and kind of help you get your steps in line so that when you're doing it for real on a production server, you're not tripping over yourself.
So, Rob, how complex is Jenkins? Like, do you need to be like a sysop kind of guru to use it and install it, or like what level of expertise do you think is needed for someone? Because I could see that this process is appealing to a small shop, a large shop. I mean, what kind of skills though? When you decide you're going to give this a try, what kind of person do you need to be to get this done?
Yeah, I would say you need to be a pretty strong developer or sysadmin, somebody who's sort of in those two worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're working with Drupal, you're used to certain technologies, usually on a LAMP stack or something like that, and getting a Java application installed on a server for the first time and working with, say, a Tomcat instance to do that or something, it's not going to be very familiar to you.
It's fun.
It's totally fun. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. You may find yourself going down a path tinkering for hours and hours and hours and learning a whole bunch of stuff. But the first time that you set it up, I probably wouldn't promise to deliver on a strict timeline. It's a little bit tricky, especially if you're going to try to configure a Jenkins instance where you're going to support a lot of different projects or project repositories.
So you're saying you wouldn't be able to do it without reading Google at least once or twice?
All of Google.
Yeah, and I would say I would recommend using something like a DigitalOcean droplet to attempt first, because it's very easy to, if you mess up, it's not going to affect anything. You can just delete the droplet and spin up a new one. Mm-hmm. They may even have an image that provides a lot of the stuff that you need. And I think they actually have a fairly good tutorial on getting through that process. So it's definitely something worth looking at. And whether or not you leave the final instance that you're using on DigitalOcean or another server, it's really a good way to introduce yourself to new technology. Anytime I have to learn something like that, I spin up a $5, $10 instance and work at it until I get comfortable with it and then build it for real.
Yeah, and I did take a look at the Jenkins website earlier today, and it does look like they have some distributions that you could download for Windows and on the Mac. So maybe there's a way you can run those locally with not having to deal with a lot of the server configuration stuff, at least to get started and to start looking at how Jenkins works, and maybe even just spin it up and see what the interface looks like and how scripts are configured and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I will say that the interface is a fair bit rougher than you might be used to compared to Drupal. But it's also it's also fairly well supported. I mean, there's not a lot of UI frills, but it works.
So there is an interface. We're not just talking about command line stuff here.
Right. Yeah. There's a full UI for it, and you can do user management, so you can have different people with different accounts to be able to log in. I think with some different permissions, so they can't break things. Yeah, there is a CLI side of it as well, so you can manage Jenkins from the command line. There's also, I think, a pretty large plugin repository of some type that you can get extensions for Jenkins to do some things, so you don't have to script it from scratch, which is nice. So yeah, it's been around for a long time, and it's pretty mature. So there's a lot of resources available, even if they're not listed on the Jenkins website itself. You might be able to find some repositories out there to pull from.
So in the last step of the process here, we've gone from a dev to a QA and then a QA to a live. Are there any particular recommendations you have related to that? Going right to a live environment. Does your Jenkins script or process change in any way there?
Yeah, so I think probably the most important thing is to just establish a consistent workflow with your team, especially if you're working on a lot of projects. Be really clear about which branches are going to be automatically deployed versus the ones that need to be manually deployed, so nobody's confused about why their change didn't get deployed. Make sure that the tests that you're running are working properly. If you're doing other things besides deployments, just to make sure that everybody who's working with it will know how to debug issues if they pop up and build fails. And one of the best ways to document stuff is just in a README in your GitHub repository. So just really clearly outline exactly how that project works. Even if it's the same on all of them, just put that information in there so the new developer on your project can easily see what their workflow is and what to expect from any tools that are automatically pushing code around.
I also, for production, something I've been doing on a couple of my projects is just like designating one person to push to production, and like making them kind of the point person for like, hey, if we need to push to production, like we're gonna follow all the steps, we're gonna do all the testing, but you're gonna be the person that presses the button to make sure that somebody's watching it to say, oh, there was a problem. We need to roll back, whatever the steps are. But having that one person that on a project that's pushing the button to push to production specifically can really save you, I think, from people kind of stepping over each other, or people that are unsure, unkind of familiar with the things that are supposed to happen versus things that can kind of crop up. It really saves a lot of anxiety, I think, with the other developers if there's one person that's kind of designated for that task.
So I'm curious to know, Rob, what your thoughts are on what sits on like a production server or a development server. Do you actually use Git on those machines, or do you actually just FTP, SFTP, or get the code there somehow, or are you using Git to pull the code down in those environments?
So we're talking about deploying or pulling code?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm asking. So what do you mean by deploy? I guess that's part one.
Sure.
So what does deploy mean to you?
Yeah, so deployment, I think we've been talking a lot about code deployment, so anything that's in a version control managed space, so anything that's in your GitHub repository in this instance. But deployment can mean other things too. It might mean that you're pushing a configuration which may or may not live in in code. I mean, we all want to use CMI and manage all our configuration for Drupal 8 that way. But there's still things that you need to go into the interface and configure by hand. You need to coordinate the timing of that with any code that's going to support that. In other situations, it might be a brand new site and you're deploying a database from scratch. And I know that Nick would just love to chime in here and talk about pushing databases with Drush, because I know that's a fantastic way to do that and to synchronize environments. I'm sure you have some tips on that. So yeah, deployment just means moving something, some asset, or some piece of functionality from point A to point B. And that can be, from a code base. It can be from one environment to another in some cases.
All right. So to drill it down a little deeper into my question is, do you consider a way to deploy code is to pull the code, like put a Git repository on your production server and pull the master branch there as a way of getting the code to that machine?
I've never done that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It actually came up in a conversation recently, but no, I think my preference would be to keep those things separate, in separate locations.
Why is that? So, in the reason I'm bringing this up, we when we were preparing for this show a week ago, we were debating, the three of us, Nick, John, and I, about whether a Git repo should reside on a production server. And a way to deploy the code is to pull it down to that production server. And we see some benefits to that and couldn't find any drawbacks to not doing it that way.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there would be some pretty heavy risk with doing that if it was your primary repository and it wasn't just an additional remote that you were going to...
No, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about it being a remote that pulls down the latest master branch.
Not exactly. It's not a separate remote. You're just logging in and pulling. So it's still the same repository. It's just not a second remote. Is you're doing the push to the second remote.
Right. Oh, I see. So you'd be treating it essentially as a local repository.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You'd be installing Git on your production server and then logging in, doing a Git pull. That would be the process.
Essentially.
Gotcha.
So the benefits we saw of doing that is that it's an easy way to, like, if you're hacked, it's an easy way to find out what has been changed on that machine that you didn't anticipate. We thought there could be some risks in doing this, but couldn't really think of one.
Yeah, I think the big difference between that workflow and what we're doing with Jenkins is you don't have those other build steps in there. So for us, I'm not sure that could work for files like CSS files, because we'd essentially be pulling, SAS files to our production server as opposed to compiled CSS, which is what we want.
Okay.
But there could be a workflow or a workaround for that.
Well, yeah, you could, because you can have Jenkins cut a new branch. So you could have Jenkins performance tests, do its build process, cut a new branch off a master, and then pull that branch and switch to it on production.
So your workflow you're proposing would be to still use Jenkins, but not use Jenkins to deploy files?
Yeah, rather than pushing the files, it would just cut a new branch or tag a branch with those CSS files. So the only one committing those CSS files is Jenkins. So you don't have those conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys see any performance issues with logging into the production server and doing a pull as opposed to having Jenkins push those files?
Performance issue in terms of what?
I mean, rsync is, I think, a little bit quicker, but I don't think it's significant. The big problem, I mean, actually, you know what? Depending on how...
Because rsync wouldn't rsync do bit level replacement on the files as opposed to deleting them and just re-adding them like what Git is going to do?
Well, I mean, for you to have performance issues from like a Git pull, you either have to have a very large database or an extreme amount of changes. I mean, they're not going to... Or you have to have like a shallow pull. I mean, I think we're going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. So what would happen? Let's just go back to Steve's use case where there's a scenario where the server is hacked, right? And either files are modified or deleted, and you have this either a task. I'm assuming this would not be a human being that needs to log into the server to do that pull. But either case, what if there's a merge conflict due to a hacked file, and now your site is extremely broken because there's merge tags inside of some of those files?
That's a good point. I mean, I guess the process would be you could log in and do like a git status and see what has been changed. You can remedy that, and then you can have a process that just does a force pull. so then there wouldn't be, or some kind of process that wipes it out. But you have a way of like testing if something has changed. I mean, obviously, there's other steps.
How would you test it otherwise? Like an easy way to test it otherwise. Let's say in that same scenario that we don't have a repository of the production server, and I mean, a hack is usually some files changing. How does that now get detected easily on the production machine? Is there a way to do that?
Especially since additional files don't generally get taken care of in rsync. Rsync is going to delete a file that was created on the production site. You know, rsync will only replace deleted files or add new files or update existing files. It's not gonna notice, hey, this file wasn't there before and doesn't exist in the upstream. Generally.
So I mean, I guess the thing I keep going over in my head is like, okay, if this is your production server and it's been hacked, you probably want to get it back up and running as quickly as possible. So just taking a tarball of the web root and then nuking it and rerunning your deployment through Jenkins or whatever you're using and getting that site back up and running and then doing the forensics on it afterwards makes a lot of more sense to me than like trying to do like git diff and try to figure out what's going on the actual production server.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of a site hack, I think we could probably do another whole episode on disaster recovery scenarios. Because, yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on the project that you're talking about. I definitely wouldn't advocate for a process that keeps a hacked site in place for very long.
No, and we're not trying to dive into this topic too much. I mean, it was really more of understanding what people's thoughts are on having the Git repository sitting on a production machine, and what are the pluses and minuses of that. That's kind of, I could see the plus in the hack side. I've been in that situation where the site had been hacked. It was very easy to do a Git status and know exactly what happened in a matter of seconds. To see what was impacted. I'm having a hard time envisioning how I would do that and at least know what was going on in an rsync environment. I'm having a hard time right now thinking that I could just go in and say in 5 seconds know exactly what was changed on that machine. And I'm not a sysops guy, so it could be why I feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not either, right? But there's definitely some tools that can monitor that stuff for you. There's a service that we've used before called Securi that will monitor system files and notify an admin of changes to those files. So that's one way you can monitor that stuff without having to use Git or a tool like that or even manually do it. I just thought of one other thing that could impact the viability of using Git on a server like that. And that's, at least in our case, we don't usually deploy all of the files that are in the repository to a remote server. It's usually a subset of those. So I'd mentioned that we have that deploy script as part of the repository, and usually there's some other things that are, I guess, below the doc root, you could say. And usually what actually gets sent up to the remote server is going to be everything from the doc root and up. So just the kind of Drupal core files and up.
Interesting. So kind of getting back on track with the topic at hand, I guess one of the questions that I had is, how does this deployment change when you're dealing with a host like Pantheon or Acquia? Because I mean, in general, this deployment with Jenkins is assuming you're managing the server on the other end. How does it work when you have a system like Acquia?
Yeah, so it definitely changes because we're not going to deploy files to that remote. What we'll usually do instead is we'll push the files to Acquia's repository as a secondary remote, and then they kind of they're just there, right? Because they're in that repository, at least for Acquia, and I'm assuming for Pantheon too. You push to that remote, and unless you're talking about production where you'd want to have a tag or have it switch to a new branch. That code's just going to be in place on the server.
Okay.
So we've talked a little bit about Jenkins. Is there some other tools that could be used instead of Jenkins for this that anyone's aware of?
Yeah, we had used DeployBot in the past,
Yep.
and Beanstalk because it has pretty much the same functionality as DeployBot. Those are the ones that I'm familiar with.
But those tools like Beanstalk is just pushing code. It's not doing any of those other processes, right?
I think there might be some support for various hooks,
Okay.
but I haven't used them.
Yeah, there's also Travis and Maven. I know Maven, there was a talk last year at the NetCamp at Brown University where they spoke about using Maven to manage deployments of Drupal. So I mean, it's pretty cool. It's a PHP based deployment tool. So it's definitely on my list to look at, but it's been 6 months since I heard that talk, so maybe I'll have to bump that up.
That's cool. I saw a mention of Maven on the Jenkins site as well, so I'm not sure how that integration will work, but apparently those tools can work together.
Okay. So why don't we move on to? Do we have anything else here with this topic that we wanted to bring up? I know it's kind of deep, but I think people get value in understanding that these tools exist and that there's ways to do your deployments better than you're doing them today, and doing them in an automated way, a consistent way, a reliable way. Rob, do you have any of the last sort of minute things you want to let our listeners know about this automated deployment? Some tips maybe you might have on where to start.
Yeah, I mean, I would say take a look at the Jenkins website and familiarize yourself with that. If those distributions that you can run on Mac or on Windows will help you to get started and not have to worry about that sysadmin side of things, that'd be awesome. I'm sure there's some tutorials out there that you can find to take a look at. But yeah, it's definitely a pretty deep tool that can do a lot of things, and I would say just focus on one task at a time that you want to use it for, and see if you can get that up and running.
So I just wanted to mention that I misspoke. It wasn't Maven. It was actually Magellan's and MagePHP that Chris from Redfin had spoken about. So those are two other options that you can look into, but it wasn't Maven.
Yeah, I thought that name was wrong. I was kind of looking myself to see if I could figure that out.
Yeah, that's why I double-checked.
So let's move on to our module of the week. John, you're going to talk about Smart IP.
I am. Before I do that, though, one other thing on the Jenkins front. If you are looking for more information about how you can kind of use Jenkins and Drupal, there's a talk at DrupalCon LA called "How Jenkins Can Work for Your Whole Team." I got the link here in the show notes. We'll put that out. Definitely worthwhile. Has some very interesting stuff in it on how you can kind of bring Jenkins into your organization.
Great. Thanks, John.
So, Smart IP. So at the beginning of the show, I talked about TunnelBear and how I've been doing some geolocation stuff. Smart IP is kind of a continuation of that. What it does is it's a module that you add onto Drupal that basically gives you IP geolocation about your user. Now, it doesn't actually do the geolocation lookups itself. You have to add either a library or a service to it to get the IP geolocation information. But then what it does is it adds it to a session variable, so you can use it in your logic for your site to make determinations of, oh, hey, this person's coming from, Germany. Let's show them, German content, so on and so forth. It's actually been really helpful. I'm actually using it on a project right now in conjunction with Cloudflare and their IP lookup functionality to do some content tweaking on sites based on a user's IP geolocation. So Smart IP is giving us the ability to do that. It also ties into views too. So if you wanted to build some sort of IP geolocation piece of content based on a view, you'd be able to do that.
So John, it's giving you, what is exactly it's giving you? It's giving you, again, it's giving you geolocation, but what data are you getting back as a developer that you can use?
So the way that I'm using it right now is I'm using country codes.
Mm-hmm.
So the IP's looked up. Cloudflare says, oh, here's the country code. Smart IP takes that information from Cloudflare and assigns it to a variable that I can use in views. I can use in rules for PHP, setting PHP variables and rules, and it allows that integration to be able to say, okay, this person's coming in from Italy. If they're coming in from Italy, show them, this Italian phrase, or don't show them this piece of content because it only applies to people in the United States.
Do you have a sense of what granularity you get from this data? How far down it goes? You mentioned country. Does it go down to zip code, city, province?
So depending on what service you're using, I think your granularity can get better. I know that Smart IP does support right down to the province.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that Smart IP supports that. I think it also depends on the service that you're using to kind of feed the information into Smart IP, whether that service supports that as well.
And what service are you using? You said using Cloudflare to get this data?
Correct.
It's not using like a Google API for this?
No. So the module ties into a couple of different services, a couple of different like IP geolocation services. I don't believe Google is one of them. I could be wrong.
Huh. Okay.
But yeah, so it ties into a couple of different services. You can, if you go to the module page, you can see the whole list of them.
Great. Any and do you know how reliable this is?
So we're using it. I'm using it for about 4 or 5 different countries in a couple of different ways, and it is pretty reliable as far as I can tell. I've done a lot of testing with TunnelBear as well as having people in the actual countries, and it's worked really well.
Excellent. Any questions anyone have about Smart IP? So, guess not. So let's wrap up the show. So. If you're listening to us now and you have a question for us, you can always call us at 401-400-2004. You can also leave us an email at talkingdrupal@gmail.com. You can visit talkingdrupal.com. We do get frequent comments on each of the episodes we have, so feel free to comment. If you have any additional information about this show or any other show, you can feel free to comment there as well. John, where can people find you online? To talk more Smart IP with you?
They can find me at John Picozzi on all the major social networks and always on at umthink.com.
Excellent. How about you, Nick?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixfan, Nixvan, and on my website, enlighteneddevelopment.com with my new logo.
Yeah, certainly check out that logo. And Rob, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, you're welcome.
On episode 116, which the last time you were on was about a year ago, so maybe we'll shoot again for a year from today. So, so where can people find you online and maybe tap into some of your expertise on our topic from today?
Sure, yeah, you guys can find me at umthink.com and on Twitter at RA8.
Excellent. RA8, 3 digits, huh? 3 characters?
That's right.
That's impressive. Is that like a 4-digit Drupal ID number?
I know, it's a little special, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. All right, excellent. I'm Stephen Cross. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen Cross with a PH, and always at parallaxinformationtechnology.com. So thanks, guys, and talk to you soon.
Cool. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Yeah.